Okay, so another sunny week in California, San Diego.
You keep rubbing that in, don't you?
I know, it's great. I just love it here, man. See, when you've grown up in Scotland with the piss and rain, it's just fabulous.
You take a Scot, or an Englishman out of the UK and they become evangelical, don't they, about the sunshine?
Absolutely. But here's what I'm most stoked about is the fact that there are more races on. Now, in the second half of the season, we've had the Tour de France, we've got UCI mountain bike races, we've got a bunch of triathlons on, not as much as normal, but it's so amazing to be able to watch that again. I forget how much I miss it.
And in fact, we're glued to any live sport we can get. If you're like us, we love live sport of any description.
Yeah.
And so you end up being thirsty for it. I feel like I'm sort of an alcoholic or something, trying to reach for the bottle.
And what's amazing is today's guest, he is actually one of the head coaches of Tour de France.
Not just one of the head coaches, he's the head coach of the Team Bahrain-McClaren, a professional cycling team. Now, if you don't follow professional cycling, Bahrain-McClaren is one of the 19 teams licensed to compete at the World Tour level. That's the highest level in professional cycling. Think like the Tour de France and all the big tours. But prior to his job at Bahrain-McClaren, David led the performance division for BMC Racing Team, another World Tour team, where he was responsible for scientific testing, equipment testing, development, nutrition, as well as coaching a whole cadre of riders, similar to his role now at Bahrain-McClaren.
And what's totally cool about Dave is he knows everything about everything, it feels like, when it comes to sports science.
He is our Yoda when it comes to sports science.
It is. But not only that, though, what's totally cool is we get to pick his brain during things like the Tour de France or other big cycling races. He is there. He is giving us constant feedback, isn't he? So we have our own little kind of
confidential feedback, of course.
That's right. Anyway, so we're excited for this podcast. Hope you guys enjoy it. Welcome, Mr. David Bailey.
He's Dr. David Bailey.
Oh, that's right. So he is. Damn it. Okay, so Dave, we've known you for a long time, mate, haven't we? Simon a little bit longer than me, but it's been a long and arduous relationship.
Arduous?
Has it?
Yeah.
No, for you, not for us.
Yeah. It resulted in you guys moving to the other side of the world, so it must have been tough, yeah.
That's right. Well, Dave, for those of you that may not know anything about our relationship, we all met in university, in college, and Dave and I used to race together, bikes, sort of, and then Dave went on to have a blossoming career in cycling, and my career just gradually faded.
What are you talking about? A blossoming career racing with me? In fact, we did an adventure race together, didn't we, Dave? I still haven't gotten you over to the dark side of XTERRA, but I'm threatening.
Yeah, because of that one experience, Lesley. Yeah.
But our adventure race experience was quite epic, wasn't it?
It was. Was it like 2 or 3 days?
It was.
Everything, wasn't it?
And I do remember you taking us the wrong way. Reading the map.
Somehow, I knew it was my fault. I knew it would have been my fault.
Of course, it's always your fault. Anyways, we've had a great relationship with Dave, but he's got some pretty epic experience over the last, 25 years of your kind of professional career. But fill us in on sort of where you started and, your studies and kind of what got you into the cycling world.
I was thinking back, and all of this stuff comes from your own interest in these things. And I was a swimmer as a kid, and as Simon said, got into racing bikes, and dare I mention it, did a bit of triathlon, which always a little bit of a taboo subject for people in cycling. But I always had a passion for sport as a kid, and my parents encouraged me and my brother to do a bunch of stuff, and then went to uni and did like a biology, physiology degree, but that specialized in exercise. And over the course of, I guess, the next 8 years of work avoidance, I got to do a PhD in exercise physiology and training and learned a bunch of knowledge that I felt was useful to athletes. And then I spent the next 3 years realizing that they didn't necessarily agree with me, but eventually learned how to communicate, not in an academic way, but in a more relevant way. And I think it's 15 years. Plus, I've worked in elite sport from the early days when I worked with, believe it or not, whitewater canoeing in the build-up to Athens Olympics. And then after that, British cycling in the build-up to Beijing, where that's where it kind of kicked off for the British cycling scene. And then took a complete career change in the sense that I moved into the commercial industrial world and moved to Switzerland. I worked for Lesley and worked with Power Bar, so they were still a sports nutrition focus, but carried on, with my real passion working in sports and in cycling. And off the back of that, I had an opportunity to work for a world tour professional cycling team, which was BMC at the time. Did 4.5, 5 years with them, and moved to my current role, which is with a team Bahrain-McClaren. So yeah, it's been an interesting journey, but the last 15 years or so has been super interesting. So I've had some great experiences, like you say.
I mean, you are literally our go-to when it comes to sports physiology and science, which is awesome. We're always WhatsApping
worrying,
you.
isn't it?
Yeah. Like, what about this and what about that? And, what are the new trends and what's fascinating?
Well, hang on. Some of our athletes might be listening and we are pretending to have all those great answers, but really I'm peppering Dave Bailey with questions during the tour. In fact, he's probably...
Yeah, during major races. Yeah, I appreciate that.
That's right, mate. But, just to kind of jump straight in there, what have been some of the biggest changes or some of the biggest, sort of changes over the last 15 years that you've noticed in sports physiology or that world?
I think that as a discipline on its own, it's become more popular. Yeah, it's been like there've been career paths now that people follow, maybe because of the advent of professionalism across all sports. The investment in certain countries, like my timing was good in the UK that I got into that more applied role with the Institute when London got the Olympics, and a bunch of cash injected into Olympic sports, and all of a sudden there was the platform for people with my expertise to get in there and work with athletes, and in that in itself provided the forum. You've got to have the opportunity in the first place, and then I always think back to one particular sporting event that resonates with me, and that was the Rugby World Cup in 2003. And I think it was, for those people who don't follow the sport, it was a big event for those that are from the colonies and the Aussies, and it was Australia v England. Sorry, Les. And the England won in the dying minutes of extra time with a drop goal from a famous English player, Johnny Wilkinson. And then, of course, that success, there were books and celebrity careers off the back of it. But one particular individual, the coach, Clive Woodward, he perhaps pioneered a more sort of scientific science and medicine approach to it and marginal gains probably before the cycling team did. And I always think, because the guy that won the game with a drop goal, he had 2 missed attempts before that. So you kind of think if he'd not made that attempt, then maybe we wouldn't have careers in this world, because it was off the back of that people believed in investing in the expertise outside of traditional coaching and so on. And for me, that was a seminal moment. And then from that, London got the Olympics. Lots of Olympic sports that didn't have much cash got money, and they could provide a platform for people like myself to get opportunities and support them. And UK GB did pretty well in the London Games, and it's moved on ever since. So
what's been interesting, because we often talk with Lesley's career, and you know this, Dave, too. So in her early career as an ITU triathlete and being coached at the time by then predominantly physiologists and so on. And so there was a noticeable gap from the athlete side about facing an army of sports scientists who perhaps didn't have the best bedside manner, or they just maybe weren't sort of necessarily trained to export the science into in ways that were appreciable and sort of actionable from athletes. Now, how have you've been at the cutting edge of that, of course, so you must face that. I'm sure many of the athletes, when you started out, here we go, a doctor of physiology, what the hell can he teach me about? I'm out there doing it. So what sort of things have you learned along the way to sort of help break down those barriers between sort of where science hits practice?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing. And I think I've been quite lucky, because I've not had too many scenarios where people have, sort of put me in the geek nerd box, and maybe they do and they don't tell me to my face. But
we're saying nothing.
In reality, I think if you've got an interest in sport, you automatically have a bit of respect for these guys anyway, and that comes across in how you communicate with them. You obviously have to stop yourself being a super fan. That never goes down too well. But at the same time, if you have an appreciation for what they've done, and you do it to some extent yourself, whether it's just part-time amateur athlete. But that helps. And then you make mistakes and you get things wrong and you learn. It's ironic that maybe things are changing now in education and academia, But when I was at college, it was, about retention of knowledge and the facts, and no one told you how to apply that, communicate that. And I think things are more vocational now. I think there's more encouragement that people get out in the real world and start applying their knowledge. But for me, it was, it was a trial and error thing, really. It was making mistakes, learning from it, listening to those that had success, speaking to yourself and you guys and your experiences, and just, reflecting on what you do and trying to get better each time. And it doesn't always work, but I guess I've figured it out over the last 15 years.
Well, what's wild for us is we often chat to you about your experiences with the tour riders specifically right now, and just how, we'll talk about maybe sort of current scientific trends or, things that we thought we knew. And then you're like, well, actually, we don't do any of that. We don't follow any of that. And here's why. I don't know whether it's metrics on training peaks or training TSS scores or
today's plan
or, any one of these things. It's kind of fascinating. What are the big things that are sort of quite prevalent in more amateurs, athletes, in terms of the data that they utilize that you really don't pay any heed to?
It's a good question, and I think it's very much driven by who you're dealing with. If you're dealing with someone whose full-time job is to be an athlete, they're not balancing it against another career. They're 100% dedicated into that, and they've come at it in an early age. They've not been through a more diverse life experience. They've not had a part-time job or started out somewhere else. They're very, very, very moldable in the first instance, but they're very, very, very narrow in terms of their outlook on life. So they, as a performance package, it's something that you have to build on and learn. And it's not just the things that perhaps are more commercially driven, whether it's, training websites or the latest theme in nutrition. You kind of have to take the whole performance package in one. So when it comes to you guys and you dealing with your athletes, those people are probably quite well informed. They do it as a pastime or semi-professionally, and they're probably more proactive. And you're probably dealing with an audience that's a little bit more engaged. Whereas in my scenario, it's their job. They didn't go through a different background in terms of education and professional experience. So they are ultimately racers, and they were really good at it. And one day someone gave them money and said, "Do you want to do this full time?" So they in our world, it's about understanding their experiences and adapting the information that we use. When it comes to the more, like you say, the things that are perhaps more topical with your athletes versus ours, I think it's very different. I think if you look at it, I always try and take a performance demands approach. I think performance can be overly complex if you try to build it from the ground up. I think if you know what you're trying to achieve, then you can get a better gauge of what you need to prioritize. And when it comes to cycling and professional cycling, there are some marginal gains from small things, and there's some massive gains. And some of the things you talk about are not that important, or they're not as important as other things. So you can have lengthy debates about metrics in training peaks or today's plan, but if the guy doesn't have the right mental attitude to performance, or they don't have a good lifestyle, out of competition, or they don't have a good nutrition program, then those small factors around whether you should use FTP or critical power, or whether you should be looking at TSS or T-score, they're relevant, but they're probably not your big chunks of performance. So, yeah.
So why do you think that is, particularly among amateur athletes? This, we spoke on the podcast a month or so ago with Alex Hutchinson, who wrote the book Endure, and he's an interesting guy because he has a PhD in physics, right? So we were talking about this preoccupation that many athletes have with metrics and data, and at what point does that actually come at the detriment of their performance or just their mindset in general? And so this is quite interesting because amateur athletes in many ways seem to almost be more preoccupied with having quantitative feedback in real time all the time. Have you got any thoughts about why that might be compared to the professional?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And it's I'll be honest, and that is that maybe they don't have the physical attributes to enable them to be professional, and they, that's a personal preference. And yeah, I've been lucky enough to work with Olympic and world champions and highly successful athletes, and I can count on one hand how many of them had that level of interest in the detail. Now, there's two sides to that: either it's not important, or it is important and they haven't got around to it yet. Mm-hmm. And amateur athletes are ahead of the game. My suspicion is the former. I think that at the end of the day, you need to have the right parents or the right genetics and the right opportunities, and then all this stuff is icing on the cake. So, if you're dealing with amateur athletes, it might be their way of coming to terms with their performance limitations, and they're trying to understand how they can get the most out of what they've got. Whereas if you're good at the sport or good as a professional cyclist, then you're good. And all this stuff is just a tool to help optimize or maximize.
Right.
Yeah, like what I find with really good athletes that have been around is they get to a point they excel very quickly. They get to a point where they're right there at the top, but just to get the win and to be at the real top, then they start drilling down on some more specifics.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So and I think that's probably needed at that top level now more than ever, because the standard is just getting higher and higher and higher, and people like you are coming into teams to really up the game, right?
So you're saying that my titanium through axles aren't going to help if I just lost 15 pounds? Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly it.
But turning that on its head a little bit about looking at how to sort of export some of the science into professional sport or in elite cycling in particular. Are there any things that, I don't wish to put you on the spot here, but I'm going to anyway. Are there any things that you can think of where you've known that the science is sort of pretty conclusive, or there's an overwhelming evidence base that would support this use, but there's been some resistance from athletes, or not a resistance, but just might be indifference to it, and how that you start to have that discussion to try and get more of the scientific evidence into people's training? Are there things that have been difficult, or athletes that listen, if it'll help me, I'll do it. What do I need to do?
It's about resisting the urge to tell them and helping them get to a point where there's a teachable moment, or there's a moment where there's a reflection and they're receptive to it. So I'm working with a cyclist now who had a fantastic start pre-COVID to the season, and then coming back, he's really struggling to find his condition. And there's a few things about his training environment and his approach to training that has, in my opinion, maybe compromised his ability to achieve his best. Now is not the time to tell him that. The time to tell him that is that when we get to the end of the year and we look back and we say, if you went through this again, and of course you can never predict a pandemic, but if you went through it again, what would you do differently? Or how do you see yourself moving to the next level? And if you can help them get there, it's much more effective for changing behavior than it is by just saying, you should do this. You know that better than me. So that's really, when it comes to kind of applying the science, particularly if you're labeled as a scientist, you probably want to resist the urge to quote research and come at it from that angle. You want to be more planting the seed and doing it that way. The one story once when I was working with my previous team around nutrition was that were the riders, or the particularly successful riders in the team, didn't want to use a particular supplement before a race. But I had a really good relationship with one of the workers in the team, the domestique as they call it, and it was just a short-term trial, and it was a supplement called bicarbonate, which has been shown to be beneficial in high-intensity exercise. And just through tricks I'd learned, I went on the bus and I spoke to not the top rider, but the one that I knew well and that I had a relationship with, and asked him if he was planning to use this supplement, to which he said, no. And then I just raised an eyebrow and carried on with what I was doing. He said, why, do you think I should? And I said, well, if you're going to give it a go, this is the perfect, the evidence shows that this is the kind of event and duration where it might help. Okay, I'll do it then. And then the rider next to him said, yeah, me too. And then the top rider said, yeah, I'll join you too. Now, if you know anything about the science of persuasion, that's consensus. And that's based off rapport and reciprocity with that rider I knew. But, I didn't learn that because I read a textbook. I learned that through experience. And that's one story where it worked. There are another 5 where it didn't work.
Well, I think that's the hardest thing is like a sort of top athlete is that you get stuck in your ways of what has been successful in the past. I think any top athlete has those obsessive compulsive tendencies. And so to change things is incredibly challenging, even if you know it is, better for your performance. And I'll give certainly from a female perspective, I know guys can be the same too at the top level, but, weight, body image issues, eating or disordered eating, you get to the point where you lean up and you lose weight and you start to go well, or you start to go quicker as a consequence, and you kind of get obsessed with that sense of it, even although you know that your body needs to cycle through different weights at different times of the season for health and immune reasons, or even if you've gotten, like, there's been times where I feel I've been too light and lost power. So even although you kind of get addicted to the sensibility of things, the emotional sort of attachment to certain things.
Well, the assumption that that progress or improvement is linear. So if a little is good, more must be better.
Right.
And I think, this is true, I think, in most sports that where they are weight dependent sports, where that plays a big role, is because it's really hard to get out of that mindset for many athletes, right? And even though you show them data that they're actually performing better power at a weight that might be heavier, that's a difficult one to still overcome. And that probably applies to men and women. Because
you look at some of those tour riders, Dave, and you're just like, I mean, they're so skinny. Like, in terms of the guys at the top, do most of them have issues with that, or do they have quite a good relationship with it? Do they struggle with it? Like, how does that look? Because they're so skinny, they can't be like that all year round. Do they have any sort of issues with it?
Well, I'm not professionally qualified to diagnose that, but I certainly think that most elite or professional endurance athletes don't probably have what you might call disordered eating. So I think sometimes that they're able to be a little bit less normal eaters compared to others because of the amount of exercise they do. But there's a real divide. There are those that it's a byproduct of their focus on training and preparing for performance, and then there are others that it's that the actual exercise actually is compensating for their poor nutrition. So when you see those guys in the Tour de France, you can't really tell one from the other than the fact that the really skinny ones that perform have probably got it right? So these guys, they might be, super lean and less than 7% body fat, 6% body fat, but they're taking on board in excess of 90 grams of carbohydrate an hour. So they really are fueling, and that's something I've learned and yet, I know guys that they really panic and lose weight, and they do that by restricting carbohydrate. And then of course that has a massive negative impact on their performance. So, they can't sustain it for long. So even the ones that have got it right and they're still fueling well, they'll get to the off season and they'll put on like 5 to 6, maybe 10 kilos. So it kind of it's a pendulum, right? So if you swing it too far one way, it's going to swing back the other way.
Yeah.
And to what extent it's healthy, and that's where we get into the debate about professional athletes and health. Arguably, they're on the other side of the U-shaped curve, right? They've gone past that optimal benefit. So it's a necessary condition, to optimize power to weight, but it has to be accompanied with fueling that supports that performance. And they do relax a bit and return to normal body composition after they achieve those goals. Yeah.
So for a tour rider, I'm just going to dig a bit deeper on it, because this is really something that's fascinating to me. So 90 grams of carbohydrate an hour. I'm assuming this is in a stage race. So what does that look like? The timing of that across 5 hours on a bike? I mean,
in simple terms, if you're taking a bottle, like a 500 milliliter drinks bottle, or bidon as they call it in French, that's about 40 grams. And then, maybe 2 gels or a bar or a rice cake, that gets you up to 80, 90. So it's not an incredible amount. When you get up to the sort of 100 plus, then it's a lot more. But the textbook says, 90 to 120 grams per hour, and maybe different carbohydrate sources so that you don't mess your stomach up with just the volume. But bike races, they don't start off at a nice sedate pace so that you can take on those drinks and gels in an orderly manner. It's normally full gas for the first hour, so you have to work with them in a way that, okay, this is what you should be targeting, and there'll be opportunities in the race when you can do that and more. And there are other opportunities where you literally can't because you're going too fast. There's crosswind. You can't even take your hand off the bars to reach down to the bottle. So that's the application of knowledge. And here's a really important part to be fueled for. So if it's the start, then make sure you're fueled up before you start. And then if the race eases off, as it often does after a break is formed, then make sure you're fueled and ready for the uphill finish.
Right.
So what's cool is when we chat to you though about like the strategies, do you know what I mean? And you're laying out, like certainly during the tour, we'll do this, we'll be WhatsApping back and forth, but you break down the entire race and give each rider a complete strategy in terms of, well, everything from when to take their nutrition. And then there's obviously the strategy of the race and what have you. But I mean, you're looking at the course and you're from previous knowledge of previous races on that course, you're literally giving them a plan of where you can feed, right?
Yeah, it starts now for next year. I mean, we don't know the route in its entirety for the Tour de France, but normally this month, so October, I don't know what the official presentation date is this year with everything that's happened, but normally you get the route then. And then off the back of that, you start to think about, your strategy, your preparation, what riders you'll need. Different races call for different types of riders. And then the key stages, so already you perhaps identify 5 or 6 of the stages, which is going to be important if you're trying to win the race overall. This year it was obviously the time trial at the end, as well as the summit finishes and then the final week. And then if you can get to them now before the winter comes in and you can't pass the mountain cols, so you can maybe go and see it now, but certainly you'd go, at the end of the spring next year and the project starts and you work forward. And like you say, Lesley, there's lots of learning from previous years. So it's not a stadium, it's not the same track, but there's a lot of similarities year by year. So after 3 or 4 years in the sport, you go back to the same places often. So you can learn from this.
Right. And how do you, because obviously the business side of the sport with sponsorships from different nutritional products or companies, and I'm sure riders come in with preferences about what they like and what their stomachs can handle. So that must be a balance as well. Like sort of, well, the team is sponsored by this, but this rider needs this. So trying to figure out a line between trying to walk that line, you as a sports scientist, must be a challenging one.
Yeah, it's often it's frustrating that when the team is speaking to new potential suppliers, whether it's nutrition or equipment, that they don't always ask the performance question, whether to me or my colleagues. It's like, is this the best nutrition supplier? Is this the best tire manufacturer? Is this the best wheel manufacturer? Because ultimately the teams first and foremost are trying to secure, financial income that means the team's viable for that year. So they'll go with the best financial deal. And as you know, these partners are interested predominantly in marketing their products. So it's in their interest that they're competitive. Otherwise they're going to be made a fool of on the world stage. But yeah, it's interesting, and I think a lot of it is there's a big placebo effect. So I think how you communicate that with the athletes when they start. So we changed clothing supplier, and that was a big challenge for us. And yet other parts where you could say that the level of the clothing was at the same level as another supplier, but just how it's communicated is also key. But in terms of nutrition, we're quite lucky that the supplier we have, or the sponsor we have this year, is. It's a supplier actually, because we actually pay for it, but it's one that's really popular among cyclists. And if there's a product that they don't have, the riders are free to, find an alternative. But yeah, you often find as a team, we battle with riders' perception of a new sponsor, whether it's a helmet or footwear or something. So it's, we have a performance first culture and a performance first mindset. So it doesn't mean it's like, well, get on with it. That's what you're having. So we do our utmost to try and accommodate those individual requests. And in many instances, riders are allowed to use different equipment as long as there's permission from the sponsor that there's either a medical condition for it or, there's evidence for it. It's not just because obviously that doesn't fit with the sponsor's objective. But we'll always try and ensure that the athlete gets the best setup, right, whether it's equipment or nutrition.
And what are there certain aspects of their equipment or the technology they use that are usually the most contentious, not contentious, but the ones that, what the team wants versus what the rider wants? So nutrition might be one. What is it, saddles or pedals or what?
Yeah, so clothing, saddles, and pedals are quite shoes. So in my first year with this team, everyone was on the same brand of shoe, and that really didn't make sense to me. Everybody has a preference to clothing and footwear. So normally teams give riders that flexibility. Saddles, yeah, if you've switched teams, it's normally if there's a change, right? So if you switched clothing or saddles or shoes, then you're going to have challenges, and people don't like change at the end of the day. But most of the saddle manufacturers, there's similar product line, so you can find a similar product, a similar shape saddle in one company to the other, and it might be that that company is interested and really engaged and wants to develop a saddle to meet that individual's needs, or it might be that they allow you to have an unbranded saddle that's a competitor. But that you won't hear about that. I mean, last year I know that a lot of our riders continue to use their own preferred shoes, but the manufacturer, our shoe supplier, made an overshoe that made it look from afar like it was a. So there are ways around it, but that's it. I mean, I remember having a conversation with a cyclist once who was a time trialist, and our helmet supplier changed the design of the time trial helmet, and it didn't in testing in a wind tunnel. It actually performed worse than the previous one for him. And if you know anything about the helmet and its interaction with the rider, it's not to say that one size fits all. And he was not so happy because it felt like a step back for him, and he couldn't understand, because he was a highly successful time trialist, he couldn't understand why he was being made to compromise his performance. And you sort of sat in that difficult situation where you kind of have to agree with his position, but you also have to sort of wake him up to the reality that it's the real world, and that, with that sponsor's input, then maybe that's why the team was able to pay him his salary. And he said, I don't get it, Dave. Do they not want me to win? I said, well, of course they want you to win, but it is a marketing exercise, because if it wasn't, why on earth did they sponsor two other teams?
Right.
So, it's sometimes, particularly coming through the institute models, the athletes got so used to everything being, the perception they have is everything for them to maximize their performance. But the real world is that
there's a business.
Yes, but there's a compromise there. And that compromise enables the team to exist, because it might be that they get this much money from one supplier versus nothing from another.
What's crazy for me, Dave, is just how many hats that you play in your role, right? Because just there you've spoken about 20 of them, everything from the knowledge of new equipment coming out, existing equipment, and I mean, how much equipment is in the biking world? There's a ton. Being up to date on all the science of all of it, knowing the nutrition of all of it. Then there's strategy, then there's management, then there's talking to the team riders. Then you also coach individual riders as well, right?
What's that? Jack of all trades, master of none.
That's right. Hey, you said it.
How many riders do you coach personally now, or how many is, or I should say, a head of performance, a head coach expected to kind of take on?
7. So the governing body of the sport brought in criteria, and I think the maximum you're allowed to coach is 10 now. But in all honesty, if you're really doing a proper full-time coaching role and not just prescribing training, it's having regular contact and face-to-face and dealing with that person's challenges in and off the bike. I think 6 to 8 is probably max. Certain guys are a lot more high maintenance than others. They're all professional athletes, and I always emphasize that I'm not a coach like when you send your kid off to play soccer, and you've got a coach that's helping develop their skills. I'm just a person who's got an expertise that may help that individual maximize their performance. So it's a partnership, right? So I can only give them as much as they give me, if that makes sense. It's got to be an agreement and a partnership, as opposed to this sort of culture where it's like, well, you tell me what to do, because if you get down that line, then you'll get the blame when it goes wrong.
Yeah, well, that's probably a good segue into that, because trying to manage the outcomes of performance. And, we know from the psychological research is we call it attribution bias, right? When things go really well, the finger points, oh yes, that was because of me. When things go badly, the finger suddenly points away from them. So how do you manage that as a sports scientist? Because that must be an incredibly challenging role. On the one hand, you're making some recommendations that are based on or exporting the science to the best of your ability. And then if things that don't go according to plan, are you going to hear the "I told you so," or you maybe not that direct, but there's that sort of sense of, oh my God, please let this be the work, so I don't have to sort of face that onslaught at the end of the day.
Oh, for sure. The simple fact is that, you don't win more than you win. So you deal with that situation more often than not. And it's it's a tough one, because in my world there's a very obvious performance measure, right? So there's no hiding from that, and it's often in front of an audience of hundreds of thousands or millions if we're lucky. So if the cyclist has a bad day, then it's not like if I had a bad day and I was working from home, no one knows about it. Whereas those guys, if they have a bad day on the bike, then everyone sees it. So it's something that can lead to a blame culture, and people spend a lot of time covering their arse, and that's really, really sad, because it shouldn't be like that, right? It's like, like I say, you've got to not win more than you'll win. But when it comes to dealing with that, then it's trying to use the word we a lot, and trying to take collective responsibility to try and move on, and the old cliche that you learn more in failure than you do from success. I mean, these things are cliche, but they are true. They are moments where you can be reflective and try and take a constructive view on it, but also understand these guys go through a grieving process, right? So, there's no point having a major debrief 5 minutes after they cross the finish line, because you're not going to get anywhere. It may take 24 hours, it may take a week, but you've got to look for that opportunity, and you've got to maximize that opportunity, because trust me, in my experience, when the guy wins, there's a line of people that want to speak to them. When they lose, they're sat on their own. And if you want to build a relationship with an athlete, that's the moment.
Right.
That's the moment, because it's hard, because it's impossible to know what to do and say. And when you get to know the individuals, like I have done, and I've worked now with one guy for more than 6 years, it's easy, because I know that he needs space for a day, or the other day I got a message, and another guy, you sent me a message after a race and said, I just don't understand. I don't know what's happening. Well, I hope he doesn't listen to this, but I don't reply deliberately for some time, because, he's going through a process.
Yeah.
It's no point engaging with him at that point, because it's going to be his, he said, she said, and it's like, we can have that conversation, but it's not going to help us long term. Reality is that you've got to wait for that opportunity where he's more engaged. And I spoke to him today, and that's 3 days afterwards. And it's more receptive to a more objective viewpoint, and then puts his hand up and say, yeah, that makes sense. I'm perhaps being unrealistic about this. And
I think in some cases where sort of not things go wrong, but just there are pivotal moments where the role of the sports scientist is also clearly visible, because much of what you do is invisible to the general public, right? It's we see these guys and gals out hammering away, but this year's Tour de France was quite a dramatic, the last time trial, and I don't necessarily need specifics on this, but just in terms of your general sense. So in that final time trial, many of the teams or the riders were switching to road bikes as they made the final ascent to the finish, and some didn't. And I imagine the sports scientists are trying to play a role in that, about whether we should or shouldn't. And I guess my question isn't about whether you should or you shouldn't, but how do you approach sort of those sorts of decisions? Is your input the driving force, or do they consult with the sports science teams to say, what do you think, but we kind of think we know what to do anyway? Or how do you approach situations like that?
I'm super lucky now that our team principal is formerly of Sky Ineos, and the culture that he's fostering is one that is led by sports science. It's a coach-led culture, so it's a little move away from the traditional team where others that don't perhaps have that expertise kind of lead the discussion. It's now got to a point where it's like, well, we have to have a strategy, and he said that strategy has to be set in place before the Tour de France starts. We cannot be 3 days out going, should we change bike or should we not? And trust me, that's how it happens in other teams. It's very few. It's the minority that have that strategy. So we spent considerable time trying to understand that particular question, and made a decision before the race even started. In fact, a month before the race even started, because it required production of a light time trial bike. So that's I'm lucky enough to be in that culture. Right. Now, did we retrospectively say, was that the right decision? Of course. We've looked at it and looked at what others have done, because you can't predict what the competition's going to do. And that's led to further debate and discussion, and I still don't know the answer.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, and not talking about Bahrain-McClaren, but just looking at, so when you see Pogacar or you see Dumoulin, one's on a road bike, one's on a TT bike, and they both had fantastic time trials, right? So I don't think it's as clear cut as you might imagine. It probably comes down to individual mindset of the rider as well, what they're used to, in addition to some of the sports science questions.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's what I'm trying to get my colleagues to realize, that let's not get too distracted by stuff we can measure just because we can measure it. I think performance represents a whole bunch of factors, and some we can measure and some we can measure really well, like how heavy the bike is or how aerodynamic the rider is on that bike. Some we're kind of measuring, but perhaps not as reliably as we would like. And some we have no idea how to quantify. So that doesn't mean we should disregard the stuff we can't measure. That's just not good science, right? So what we have to say is, like, here's a blank piece of paper. Here's all the things that could have contributed to time trial performance on that day. And that's a lot of things. And then we have to say, well, what can we measure? Okay, this. Now, what can't we measure? Okay, can we ever get to a point where we can better understand that? Do we think that even though we can't measure it, it's actually quite important? And then that should help us weight the different factors. What you saw happen on that day was, everyone, and I would say to some extent the bike industry is probably quite happy about that, because it became a topical discussion. But a simple thing for you, aerodynamically, the rider is 80% of drag. In terms of weight, the rider is 90% of weight. So why would a 1 kilo difference in bike weight make such a significant impact on performance? As a weighting, surely the rider's physical ability on that day, their mindset, their pacing strategy, their nutrition before the race, how they've managed the 3 weeks of racing before that day. Because if you try and predict a time trial after 2.5 weeks of racing around France, you're a confident person. So it's very easy to fall into this trap, and you see a lot of people do that. Is it irrelevant? No, not at all. You still need to look at it, and you still need to make a decision, and that's what we did before the race. But I guess my message is, don't believe the hype.
Right. And what's your take on sort of Pogacar's ride in the end? Is this, when you're sniffing at a podium or a win, you get this incredible boost mentally. Was it all down to that, do you think, for him, or was it just a combination of Roglic having a little bit of a sort of a meltdown, or what? How do you make sense of those performances?
Unfair to Primož to say that he had a meltdown. I think he had a pretty good time trial. He was
he's fifth. Yeah, great. Still a good ride.
I think against his standards, a guy that's won time trials in Grand Tours as recently as last year's Vuelta and won the Vuelta, I think it was below his expectations. That's clear. And of course, they didn't want to lose the race. To lose 2 minutes to Pogacar is probably more in his favour than an underperformance from Primož. So I think that Tadej just represents this crop of young riders that are coming through now. Him and Evenepoel, and then the two cyclocross guys in Wout van Aert and Mathieu van der Poel and Egan Bernal, who won the Tour last year. And these guys are super, it's clear they're talented. They have a fantastic physical capacity. And, that's well documented. And these guys are happy to share their data these days. But I don't think you should be underrated. Their fear of performance, it doesn't exist. They've got nothing to lose. If you put yourself in Pogacar's position, going into that final time trial, he's 22 the day after. So he's 21, his first Tour de France. He's already, what's he got to lose? If he puts everything on the line and he blows up on the final climb, then people are going to maybe see him in a bit of a negative light for 24 hours, but they won't disregard what he'd done. He'd won 2 stages already, or one, and he'd shown in previous races his ability. So that's a dangerous thing. The pressure's on Roglic. If you're in yellow and people think, you saw his teammates on the finish line expecting him to win. Oh. They thought it was a done deal. Wiggins did this in 2012 when he won the Tour. He cemented it with the Tour. Trust me, it's 10 times harder for Roglic than it was for Pogacar.
Oh, yeah.
He had to deliver, and he could lose everything that day, whereas Pogacar could lose nothing and win everything. And that has a massive psychological impact on their performance, and that's probably what you saw.
Yeah.
And that didn't happen in one moment. That was a slow realization. I was watching the Eurosport coverage, and they kept coming to Brad Wiggins, who's now a correspondent, and saying, Roglic has gone off on a negative split here. That's why he's lost time. And then there was that realization through the race that actually, maybe it's not going great. And it wasn't until that climb that you realized that it had switched and that Roglic was losing the race. And then you perhaps saw, when Roglic crossed the finish line, the anxiety that was him at his limit on that final climb, realizing that the yellow jersey was slipping away from him. And it wasn't so much that he was physically exhausted. It was just the stress and mental turmoil that he was going through, seeing the race slip away from him.
It was heartbreaking to watch as a spectator, but the winner in this, if there is such a thing for those guys, is the sport of cycling, because it was one of the most exciting things I've seen in the Tour for years, and it brought it to life. It was incredible. I mean, it's heartbreaking to see. Two from the same country, friends as well. But yeah.
So, do you notice any sort of personality traits that are common across these top riders? You talked about coping with pressure, right? But what are some other traits that you notice, like time and time again with these top guys?
There are some,
special characters. There are some special characters.
They're special, yeah. They may come across as these sort of celebrities, well-groomed PR delights, but they're not. They're ruthless people. They are ruthless. They're winners. They're super dedicated. They're obsessive. They've got this obsession to every aspect of performance, and sometimes that goes wrong and it becomes counterproductive. But more often than not, they've got an opinion on everything. They're arrogant. They're often overconfident. The best ones in the world can turn it on and off. So, when it's competition, you speak to their peers, they'll tell you, he's a ruthless bastard in racing. He'll do everything he can to win, but off the bike, he's a completely amiable person. There are others that can't separate that, and they're the challenging people to work with. But in general, what differentiates them is their single-mindedness, their attention to detail. They just win at all costs, and that on top of the physical capacity is what makes the winners.
And do you think you can train that in people to a certain extent, or coach that? I mean, this is an impossible question to ask. I realize that, but
yeah, I think you can. And I think that there's been a lot of research looked at what makes an Olympic champion, what makes a Tour de France winner. And there's reports out there in the public domain that you can read. The UK Sport did one on the British Olympians, the medalists in recent Olympics. And it's things like, a lot of it's obviously is nature part, right? So you need to have the genes to start with, but it's that nurture. So I always say to people in my job, I'm dealing with the top of the iceberg, maybe the last 1%. They've gone through so much individually as athletes, as a junior, as an under 23, or even just when they were kids and got into the sport. And it's what the people who influence that part of their life, they're the ones that can train that. They're the ones that, and probably completely subconsciously, or they're completely unaware of what impact they're having. But one example might be that there's a general trend that athletes who are highly successful in their family setting with their siblings and with their parents, their performances are considered normal. That we might consider them absolutely exceptional, but we expect that. That's normal. So there you go. All of a sudden, you get into that environment where you're expected to perform, you're paid to do it, there's TV cameras on you. Yeah, but throughout my childhood, it was expected. It was normal.
Yeah.
Wow.
But I can't train that now.
Yeah.
That has to be done in that nature, that nurture part of that athlete's life.
It's got to be so hard just managing all those personalities because, okay, you've got the riders, but then you have the management team and everything that goes into sort of, yeah.
But that's why he drinks so heavily.
That's right.
Yeah.
Can't you tell? But I mean, that is partly your outlet, isn't it? I mean, you still train a bunch when you're going on these training camps with riders, when you're out there at some of the tours and stuff, right? You get out, you do runs, you do bikes, you sort of keep your sanity by keeping fit, right?
Are you allowed to do any riding with them? Or is that an insurance no-no?
I'm not, look, Simon, if anyone should know why you shouldn't ride with a professional cyclist, it's me.
That's true. I've sat behind you many a time. No.
The occasional coffee ride, I'll ride with them, but otherwise, I'm not that stupid. But no, I kind of come to understand over the years that, yeah, it's just as important for your mental health as your physical health. And yeah, as and when I get the opportunity, I like to do some exercise just so I can stay mentally fresh. Yeah. Because if you don't, you spend the whole day sat in a car or on a bus, or you end up at the bar at the end of the day, which is none of those things are good for your physical or mental health. So
no, I'm sure
you're not kidding. Now, During these weird times, how has it been for the riders, during sort of lockdown and COVID? And what strategies did you have to use with them to help them keep motivated and, applied?
Yeah, so of our 29 riders, I think 11 were in countries where they were locked down in their apartments or their houses. The others were able to train outside. So sort of split that way. And the ones that were stuck in, that was a big challenge, right? And we had guys that were for 8 weeks doing up to 20, 25 hours a week on the home trainer, on their static bike, double days and things. Others that literally were like 6 to 8 hours a week because they just didn't have the mental fortitude to get on the home trainer despite Zwift, despite everything else. Those in general, we had a kind of a team-wide message that, we didn't know like everyone else when it was going to end. So we wanted it was maintenance. It was about being ready to race. And then once we got over the course of a couple of months, the inkling that things would start again, end of July, beginning of August, we wanted to be ready to race from then. We'd started the season well and we wanted to continue that. Now with hindsight, but as a coach and as a sports scientist, it might have been a good idea to take a 2 to 4 week break at the beginning, but we didn't know it was going to be 3 months. So you can't really say for that. But in general, it was super interesting because cyclists typically, they're either in their off-season competition preparatory phase or they're in a competition phase which runs from January to October. So in that period, they're race, recover. So it was the one time in my professional career working in cycling where you could actually train like a normal athlete, who's doing, a dozen competitions a year. And it was really interesting to see the mindset of the different people. There were the guys that liked the training who were super focused and motivated. It was only when we had the financial constraints of the lockdown that they lost a bit of focus. And then there were the guys that were just pure racers who really struggled. They really didn't know quite, what to do. They just went out and they maintained the volume, but they probably didn't push hard at all because that was just so adverse to them. They're so used to that polarized nature of like training and racing. So it was a super good experience. So we learned a lot from it about, how to train and the merits of training, because you don't normally get that opportunity in a professional cycling year because there's so many races.
Sure. Well, we asked when we told some of our athletes that we were having you on our podcast, and we said, okay, you've got a chance to ask any of your sports science questions. I'm trying to filter out the ones that were just crazy. But so I've got a couple of questions here that came in from some of our athletes. So one, Tanya Deeks in Ontario, Canada. We've already actually tapped into some of the COVID-related training. But is there anything that worked well that they discovered or you discovered because of the COVID training environment that you think, well, actually, we might try and do this like in the future, regardless of COVID?
So with the riders themselves, so obviously going back to racing, and then when we did camps, while things were still semi-locked down, we had to really up our game in terms of hygiene and the environment. So what a lot of people don't really know is a lot of athletes are pretty hygiene skilled anyway. The whole hand washing and social distancing has been around in professional sport, elite sport for a long time. Okay, mask wearing wasn't so popular, but even I know some riders that were using that before COVID. So I guess it was a great opportunity to remind people of the merits of that, because you can train and prepare physically and get everything right. But if you get sick, everything's out the window. So it's always good to have an experience. And I guess that this whole experience has reinforced that, and it's become more commonplace, and it's made that behavior more routine. So going forwards, there was maybe 50% of the team that carried hand gel around with them. Now everyone's going to have it, and everyone's going to have a mask. And, I think in general, that's going to change for everybody. Like I say, we learned a lot about training. So now we understand what happens if you stop a season midway through and then are just dependent purely on those riders doing their work from home without the venue of training camps or races. So we've understood how the guys detrain and how quickly they adapt again, or how to maintain condition. So there's lots that we've learned about that side of things. And also as a group, we already are work virtually a lot because we don't have the same venue. So this forced us even more into platforms like, video conferencing. And so I think we got better at that because we had to use it more just for the operation of the team rather than get on a plane and meeting somewhere, which it meant that when we got to races this year, it was more commonplace to have input. So normally races are it's really hard to get into contact with the staff and riders at the race because they're in a little bubble anyway. irrespective of COVID. And this time round, it was much easier because they're just so familiar with the technology and having had to use that for the preceding 4 months.
Yeah. Oh, fascinating. I've got a question from David Cohen in New York. What metrics or markers do you use, so the quantifiable metrics that aren't built into training software? Are there things that like professional cyclists or coaches in professional cycling use, but that aren't sort of necessarily built into some software?
Yeah, I think they're all tools to start with. So they're the more common ones. But yeah, if you take some of the common ones that you get through training platforms, for example, yeah, we use those, but then we might, because we have the opportunity to collect so much information, we might fine tune them a bit. We may work with that particular platform, and we have done with today's plan to create metrics that aren't commonly available to their commercial clients, that are learnings from the scientific research as well as our experience. Then there's a lot of things, away from the bike, like sleep and recovery and nutrition, where we have markers that perhaps most people who are just working off the training platform don't use. So sleep, we use the Oura Ring a lot, and again, that's a commercially available product, but we've had a relationship with them, and we've got interconnectivity between them and our training platform, and they've kind of evolve some of their metrics, and we've been able to give them feedback and say, hey, this one's really, really good. And we tend to steer away from the algorithms that they use for their commercial clients. So they might have a sleep score, they might have we look at that, but we say, actually, from our experience in our group, because at the end of the day, our guys are outliers, they don't fit that normal curve. So they're going to be different in every aspect. So we evolve them. And then, there's some things that there aren't metrics for, like, subjective ratings and feelings and stuff. So we factor those in.
Feelings? There's no place for feelings, man. Another question. This is also from David. He was on a roll from New York. Why do tour cyclists give up? This is verbatim. Why do cyclists give up wattage and still run tubular tires? Triathletes seem to be chasing every watt, but what's stopping tour riders from doing the same, as opposed to meaning tubeless? So
there's two questions there, right? So why do they give up their data, and why do they still use tubulars? Is that
right?
So the data one's an interesting one, and I kind of got two viewpoints on it. One, some teams don't permit riders to share that data. You won't see too many people from Ineos sharing data. Don't think and riders, like, if they have a Strava account, they have a pro account where they can block their heart rate and power. To be honest with you, I don't care either way. I think it's a bit silly to give up anything that might give your opponents a competitive advantage. But with the knowledge we have nowadays, you can kind of predict performance. I mean, I can predict what Pogacar did on that final climb, and I'm pretty sure it's accurate to within 0.1 watt per kilo. So they're just tools, right? So they're, it's giving away the number doesn't necessarily give away the intellectual property, right? It's what you do with those tools that is the intellectual property of that. Right.
I think the question is more aimed at giving up wattage in terms of, if you use tubulars, you're going to be slower.
Right. So why did they do that in the Tour? Why did they still run tubulars, even although
you might be sacrificing watts instead of running tubulars? Is that?
Yeah, I'm with David on that one. In that, there's clear evidence now that the tubeless tires are faster in terms of rolling resistance. So again, you have to try not to get drawn into the marketing. So you talk about tire selection. Well, what do you have a tire for? Well, grip. You have it for suspension. So there's no suspension on road bikes. So, and then you have puncture resistance, right? So if you're just talking about rolling resistance, yes, that's a factor that you're trying to overcome in terms of drag and you need force to. But also, a tubeless tire might be compromised in its puncture protection. It might be compromised in its handling. Now, we know that they're pretty close, and the manufacturers of tubular tires also make tubeless tires. And they're pushing the tubeless tires. So cycling is a very traditional sport, and it takes a long time to change. It took a long time to embrace electronic gear shifting. It took a long time. We're still struggling with disc brakes. So, it's not surprising. Creatures of habit don't like these things. They often think there's a marketing agenda behind it. I'm with him on the tubeless point, and I'm pushing that from my side.
Oh.
we have evidence from our tyre supplier. It also requires, you can appreciate, like a complete change in all the wheels. So, if you, for example, we run tubeless at the Classics, but then, that rider might say, I had that tyre at the Classics, I want it in this road race. And then the mechanics have said, well, I haven't got it for a road wheel, only a Classics wheel. So there's the logistics side of it. What I do in that situation, I take 2 steps back and say, how, in terms of the whole performance picture, how important is tyre, whether it's a tubular or tubeless? It's probably negligible, right? Compared to that individual's physical condition on the day, their nutrition, their mindset, all the things I've talked about. So I'll fight that battle as and when I need to, but I'm not going to waste too much energy on that now. So, I hear him. I agree with him. Yeah. It's a slow burn. Will change anyway, because at some point the manufacturers will say you're using that or you don't get any tyres.
I think the biggest thing we're getting from you here, which we obviously Simon and I knew, but hopefully it'll help the listeners, is that it's a global picture, right? You can't isolate in any one thing. And while it's important to look at attention to detail, you don't want to get obsessed with it, absorbed with it, and it be, just everything. It's got, it really has to come in that whole picture.
Well, and the other thing that I find, so a couple things, more than a couple things I've learned from you, Dave, obviously, but one consistent theme is whenever I ask you what is a fairly microscopic question, and after the eye roll from you, it's then comes back to, well, what are the performance demands? What are you trying to do? And it's a really nice way of approaching sports science questions, because we field questions that are very specific from athletes all the time. Right. But really, you come back to, well, what is it that you're trying to be good at? What is it you're trying? What are the performance demands of events that you want to do really well at it? So you're backing into it versus kind of trying to build the box, create it from scratch. And that is, it might seem like such a simple thing to get your head around, but it's actually quite a paradigm shift for many coaches and athletes to even think that way.
For sure. Absolutely. 100%. It's human nature to try and simplify these things, right? And ultimately it's multifactorial. And
so really should I change to bladed spokes?
Say again?
So should I change to bladed spokes? Is that going to help me on my Saturday morning World Championships?
Hey, you know all about the placebo effect.
That's right, mate.
Well, Dave, it's been a pleasure to chat to you as always. The ribbing that you take from us, we're grateful for that too. I hope that the conditions in Switzerland improve as well as we do over here in the US with COVID. So, well, thanks for being on our podcast, and
we'll get you out here in San Diego soon, hopefully, so that you can drop him again.
Hey, he's got an FTP of over 400 watts. Do you know that?
Is your FTP over 400 watts? Is it?
That's the rumour, yeah.
He's had to amputate both arms to get there, but
I'm still threatening that you'll come and race in XTERRA one of these days. Can we get you?
Well, he's from a swimming background. He's done triathlon. He'd be a demon. I mean, obviously he's got a bit of a weak head, but if he could get that in.
Hey guys, but no, seriously, thanks so much for the invite. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Dave. Right, good
cheers,
chat,
buddy.
Okay, bye now.
We hope you enjoyed today's podcast, and if you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe.
If you want to learn more, head over to XTERRAplanet.com. There you can register for your next off-road race, learn more about this podcast, and find some amazing gear. If you have questions or comments, you can email us at podcast@XTERRAplanet.com.
And if you're interested in learning more about how to master your brain for endurance sports, we've written a book.
It's called The Brave Athlete and is available everywhere they sell books.
And we even have an audiobook. In fact, we narrate it.
Yes, that's not exactly a great selling point.